Hey there, I'm Mike Henry, and this is my Procreate 5 demo for the piece I call The Descent. So I painted this directly after painting the Neon Beach piece, and I wanted to do something that was just tonally completely the opposite in every way. So I started just by doing another symmetry piece. I wanted just a character that was staring right at us, and I wanted to do features that I don't normally draw. So I just kind of drew this like by the book detective looking guy, somewhat retro, not entirely, but maybe, and that's the entire spirit of this, was just doing this one dude. Then once I did the dude, I was like, okay, what else am I going to do with him? I was originally going to have him just walking through the city in the rain or something, and I thought, no, what if I put all these tentacles around him and I do like this sort of Cthulhu type thing? And so that's where this went. You can see those vertical lines for the rain. And then I was like, all right, let's get going. One thing that you'll notice here, though, is that I start painting it symmetrically. But when I get to the shadow, I don't do the shadow work symmetrically. I was going to do a demo of why, but it was because it was a bug that was introduced recently in Procreate 5, and I had to come up with a workaround. And then today, I think it was today actually, or maybe yesterday, it was patched out. So it's not a concern anymore. But just so you know, when I get to the shadow part, what happened was if you painted symmetrically, everything was fine. But then if you tried to smudge symmetrically, it would not smudge the same way on each side of your dividing line. So if I were starting to smudge, let's say, the face, his cheekbone on one side would look different than the cheekbone on the other side, and it was too hard to manage. In fact, there were some other little weird glitches with it as well, but it's all been fixed. But for this one, I had to come up with a workaround. It just kind of dawned on me that this character looks like if John Hamm and Conan O'Brien had a child somehow. But anyways, right here, I'm going and painting and smudging, and I'm not noticing the problem yet because it's just a big soft smudge for the ambient occlusion shadow underneath his neck. And then here's where you can see it happening. See, on one side, the ear was different than the other side, and I tried to work with it. You can see me painting just a big smudge on his face and being like, is this working? Why isn't this working? And I have to try and figure out what I'm going to do. So I just decide I'm going to paint one side at a time and then flip it. So you can see me erasing on the other side there. I wiped out the one ear, and since you can't see it, but when you're working on the file and you've got the symmetry going, you've got that line in the middle that's letting you know where the symmetry happens. So I'm just using that as my guide. So now I've got the canvas zoomed in when I was working on it, and I was just painting on the one side of it and just trying to get it right, and then I'll just duplicate that, flip it, line it up, convert both of those layers from multiply back to normal, and merge them together, and then flip them back to multiply. So I kept some more layers going than I normally do, as far as having like several shadow layers that are sort of turning on and off, and I'm duplicating and having multiple ones going so that they're not interfering with the others, and then merging them together. But that's just the workaround that I came up with for this. Luckily, it only applied to this, and I did another piece after this one that had no symmetry, and so it was just easy, and then the update came out, so I didn't have to worry about it. Interestingly, this is the way that you would work before the symmetry tool in Procreate, or it's one of the ways that you can work in Photoshop. The easier way, I think, to work in Photoshop and do symmetry is just with like a clone, or a smart object basically, but you would have to do that and probably eventually merge them anyways. So anyways, it's similar but different. So we are continuing to focus on just the one side. You can see that I am doing some overpaint onto the other side of where that line would be, and so right here I create a box by filling the canvas, and then I just transform that box until it lines up with that line, use that as my selection, delete away, and duplicate and flip, and that's how we get this symmetry that you're looking at right here. Luckily for his hair was not symmetrical. It's the only thing on him that's not symmetrical, so it was the hair was the easiest part basically, because I wasn't concerned about that. Now, as for the vibe of this, as I said, very different from other recent pieces. We had the bright neon colors in the last few, and these sort of just like, I don't know, well, mostly all women as well. And now here we're back to sort of that solitary, detective-y type dude. He obviously looks a little bit tired, and he will, of course, be in the rain, although his hair is holding up pretty good against the rain. I've got these tentacles around him, and so it's called the descent, as in like the descent into madness kind of thing. And it's just trying to tell a very simple story of this guy walking in the rain. There's all these tentacles around him. Are they really around him? Is he just seeing them? Does he know he's kind of going crazy, but he can't stop seeing them, so he's just sort of pressing on? And that is the vibe of the piece. Again, every time you see those multiply layers switch to normal, that's because I'm merging them together, and I want them to merge together cleanly, and then I flip them back to multiply. Here we're doing the jacket, and the suit jacket, it doesn't really need much as far as making sure that symmetry is perfect, so I just did all of that more or less like by hand, quote unquote. I didn't have to do any mirroring and flipping. I did do it on the coat though, and of course I painted on the left side of the overcoat because there's more of it, and then after I get that whole side painted, I will duplicate it and flip it as well. So we wrap up the shadows on the coat, and then in a second you'll see this texture appear on it. That's a new brush in Procreate 5. It's called Honey Eater. I also used it on the Neon Beach piece, but in a different way. I just dig it. I think it's pretty cool, so I just threw it on there. I won't be using it a lot. I'll just try to use it sparingly, but since I used it there, and then here I was like, oh, let's get that gradient going, but keep it messy and kind of natural, but because it's also kind of like dots, it's kind of not natural. Anyways, it just seemed like it worked for this piece, so I went with it. So then now we got just a little bit of a heavier shadow underneath his neck, underneath his chin on his neck, and we've got the shine going in his hair. I wanted it to be a little shinier than normal because he's in the rain, but again, the tone of this piece is kind of like this retro natural medium-y type vibe, so I didn't want anything to get kind of like too digital looking, so I tried to keep it all under control. I wanted to give him a little bit of a 5 o'clock shadow since I was starting to push that he's a little tired, maybe a little stressed out, so he's got those big bags under his eyes, and then on top of that he's got this 5 o'clock shadow, like maybe it's not intense, but he's just not entirely taking care of himself. And now we're going to do a top-down shadow on him. Now, in such diffused lighting as what theoretically a rainy day would be, he wouldn't have this harsh of a shadow, but I did want to have a hard shadow as for structure purposes. But my plan was to put it in heavy like this and then lower the opacity, which is exactly what I end up doing. This is the same shadow that the ambient occlusion was done with, which is like a grayish, greenish color. Barely green, mostly gray. Again, the spirit of this was, let's get away from something crazy colorful and get into something that's a little bit more like earthy and muted and stuff. So my family and I recently watched Howl's Moving Castle, For some reason, it's the like Miyazaki movie that I bought and never watched and never watched and never watched. And then since all the Ghibli movies got put up on Apple, on iTunes and stuff, we bought them all. And we decided to sit down and watch Howl's Moving Castle because we'd never seen it and our kids had never seen it. This is all leading to me saying, I love the way Miyazaki and his movies handle water, like rain and crying. In fact, there's a part in Howl's Moving Castle where a character just bursts into tears and there are these big globule tears coming out. I think he also did that in Ponyo and probably all the movies. I just can't remember all the movies, just remember some of the distinct times. So for this one, since it's got this like real serious character, I kind of wanted to also have these big, fat, cartoony raindrops that just look like they have some weight to them and that they're really coming down, and that if they hit, they would and just sort of like just be the heaviest, fattest, wettest raindrops ever. So that was the spirit behind doing them so big and so deliberately shaped like raindrops. It's easier to do like real rain, where you're just putting a bunch of streaks across the screen and some effects, and you're making it look like it's just a downpour. That's kind of easier to do with like certain digital tricks. But with this, because of the look of him, I also wanted to capture something similar in the rain. So the way I did this, by the way, just real quick, was I used black and did the silhouette for each one of those raindrops. And then I selected that, and on a new layer with white, I outlined each one of those raindrops and then lowered that opacity, and then on another layer with white, put the little shine in there. And then the same thing is true with all of the water that's bouncing off of his shoulders. It's black, and then a white outline, and then a white dot for the shine. Off camera, by the way, this is also happening on his head, on the top of his head, and coming off of his ears and stuff. We will also be doing some drips and things like that, and they're all going to be done in the exact same way to try and keep that consistency, and it's just kind of like fun to do all of this. If I were trying to make the overall image more realistic, or maybe surrealistic to some degree, I would go in and put like little reflections on like every water drop, but I didn't really want it to be so crazy. But it's still stylized, but not that to that level where it's just kind of bonkers. So now we're putting some wet on his trench coat just by using, I can't remember which brush, but some messy brush, and putting it in there as a multiply and lowering the opacity of it. We get a little bit of streaky rain in the background just to fill out that distance, and we lower its opacity and slightly blur it a little. Here for a minute, I thought it'd be cool to have like buildings floating away and have the tentacles also involved, because I just thought that kind of looked like madness, but it also then starts looking a bit too much like Death Stranding, and that was something I definitely didn't want to do. Even though I love that game, I didn't want to pull too much from that, so I said, okay, let's just go back to the tentacle idea. And by the way, the tentacles were painted. There's a new brush in the artistic section called Aurora, and that's what I used to paint these tentacles. Well, to do the base for these tentacles. I then switched and used a few other brushes here or there just to get all the lighting that I wanted on them, but that's the gist of them. Here we put that purple down, you can see I set it as a multiply, and then I lowered its opacity just to get some more play, some more like color variation on that on the tentacles. And now we are doing a bunch of just sort of lighting things. We're doing some exterior shadows that are encroaching on the tentacles so that we can round them out a little bit. I also duplicated a bunch of the water droplets and moved them all around so that we could make sure that we get even more rain in the scene. Going back to the Aurora brush, we put a little bit of shine on those tentacles. And then here's where we start playing with color balance, and we start playing with the chromatic aberration, but a more subtle version of it than we did in the others. I think that can also be used pretty effectively for somebody kind of going bonkers, but I didn't want it to be overbearing so that everything starts feeling super digital. I wanted it to feel more cinematic than digital. So here now we've really changed the vibe of the piece with some of the color balance changes that we've made, and then we also have done some slight curves boosts to bring it all up a little bit more richer, which is excellent English. Actually, that's his name, Richard Moore. No, that's already a guy. Anyways, so here we have the final piece. I feel like it's worth talking about color balance real quick, so let's do that. We have a piece here that has a pretty good range. There's a lot going on, so there's lots of colors that we could be looking at. Let's see what color balance does. For those of you who are not familiar with it, color balance is also something that is used in Photoshop quite a bit. Right now, let's just look at what we've got. We've got the layer of the piece of art that we're working on. Let's duplicate it just so that we don't lose any progress. We can go back if we have to much more easily. And I'll get this a little bit bigger here so that we can really see all the changes. Color balance is under the magic wand in the adjustment section. All the way almost at the bottom, right here is color balance. Let's click that on. So this is the new UI for color balance in Procreate 5. You can see here that we've got cyan to red, magenta to green, and yellow to blue. Then we've got this little sun over here that we can tap, and we can change whether or not we are adjusting the shadows, the midtones, or the highlights. To be honest, this UI I don't like as much as the previous UI. I know that they tried to get it kind of like out of the viewing distance, the viewing area, I mean, but at the same time having them all along the bottom like that is kind of, there's more physical movement needed in order to address all of them, but that's just a minor gripe. Let's talk about what these things do. So right now you can see we've got shadows selected, so let's keep that selected. Now, what do we do whenever we've got a new layer effect or something like that? We play around with it. So if I take this slider on the left, this cyan and red slider, and we move it all the way cyan, we see that the backpack gets a lot more blue. We see, where else? Mostly the backpack. We see his coat gets more blue. We see that the stock on his gun gets more blue. Basically, we see the red kind of going away, and we see the blue taking over. For now, let's jump to midtones and do the same thing. Cyan. Now, all of those things that were sitting in the mid-range have had a lot of their red sucked out and moved over to cyan. And if we do the same thing with highlights, we get like just a very cyan image now overall. So let's undo those changes, and let's quickly go back to shadows and push it towards red. Obviously, it makes things more red. Cool. So now that you understand those basics, that each one of these is about a range of value, and then it is impacting the color of those based on the slider, that means you can do two major things. You can play around with your image and see if you get something that's kind of more interesting to look at, or you can very deliberately come in and try to do stuff. So let's say that we want this to have a more stylized lighting where the shadows are more purple and the sunlight is more yellow. Let's just make that up right now. So first things first, stay in the shadows and move the shadows a little bit more magenta. Maybe put a little bit of cyan in there, something like that. Let's leave yellow and blue completely alone for now. And then if we go to the midtones, let's also push those maybe slightly magenta. It's going to get really magenta. And then slightly yellow. And then move the highlights like very yellow, let's say. So that we get something like that. I don't know if this is achieving the bullshit goal that I just set out for us, but let's just say we change the look of it. In fact, it kind of looks like an old Instagram filter or something. So let's finalize it just by clicking away. So this is where we're at, and then this is where we were. So I think that while this one here is still the right way to go because it's not too affected, now when we look at this one feels pretty rich actually. There's some good things going on in here that we may like in some ways, but I think it's a little much. It's a little acidic. So let's real quick just try one more. Let's duplicate that original again and go back to color balance, and let's just try something like I don't know, super extreme. Let's go into our shadows and push those more green. Maybe a little blue. And then we go to our midtones and we make those a little bit more yellow. Maybe also a little cyan. No, let's not do that. A little red. And then let's make our highlights. Oh, I don't know. I'm totally making this shit up at this point. A little more cyan. Okay, what do we got here? Let's see. So this is where we are now, and this is where we were before. So you can see some things got dramatically changed, and other things didn't really change much at all. But this is an interesting way for you to impact your art, where you are, again, making either a conscious decision and changing something because you want to capture a little bit, or you are just trying to play with it and see if there's something interesting you can capture. The last trick I'll sort of show you here is something that I like to do. Let's take this top one. I'm not saying I would want to push this drawing in this direction, but let's say I did. Once you do these adjustments, you might say, oh, I like it, but it's a little too much. The simple fix is just you take that layer and you lower its opacity. And see, when you lower it, you get some of what you're going for there, but it also brings in the original. In fact, I like to do it this way. I like to take it all the way to 0, and then I slowly pull it up, and then I go, ooh, that kind of looks nice. So now I can toggle this on and off, and I can see the before and after, and I can say, oh yeah, I do kind of like the way that impacted the drawing. One last thing I will say, the way that I most often use this is I just go into color balance, because I tend to have certain proclivities that I try to work out, and I usually go into shadows and I kind of push like a little bit more cyan into them, and then I usually go into like the midtones and push like a little more purple into them, just something like that, let's say a little more magenta, sorry, not purple, and I take a look at that and I see if I like the way that looks. But those types of subtle changes is what you're going to probably be doing more often. So I hope that gives you a little bit of an explanation as to how, at the very least, I use color balance, and a lot of other people I know. And so that's a way that I took this piece from the palette that we were working with before, and then at the end we tweaked it a little bit and got something like this that ultimately I find a little bit more interesting, but that could also be because I stared at it for a long time while I was making it. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit like, please hit subscribe, all that crap, and I'll see you on the next video. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.